Hey everybody, Ethan here. Hey, real quick, before we jump into today's episode, I just want to give you a quick heads up. So, this is actually a re release of one of our earlier episodes that, in all honesty, I don't think this episode got the attention it deserved the first time around. We call this episode one of our slow burners, where initially not a lot of people listened to it, not a lot of people downloaded it, but I noticed that over time it started to build up some steam, and so I think that it is absolutely worth republishing here. And so this episode here is all about autonomy, how to give your team more freedom, more ownership, more space to just operate without losing accountability or performance. And this is a topic that I keep coming back to in coaching and workshops. I hear managers ask all the time, like, look, how do I stop micromanaging but still make sure things get done? So, anyways, when we first released this episode, I think it was episode 72, and we called it "Solving for Autonomy: Why and How." Which, yeah, wasn't the clearest title. So we're giving it a fresh name, a second life, because I think the ideas in here are just as relevant now than they ever have been. So, anyways, all right, let's get into it. And by the way, as you know, we don't do ads on this podcast, things like that. And so, look, if you could just do us a huge favor, open up the Apple Podcast, Spotify podcast on your phone and just leave us a quick review. It just helps other people find the show. It spreads the good word. All right, enough on that. Enjoy the episode. Alrighty, folks. We are back for another episode of the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast, and we are excited to be here today because this is going to be a cool episode. My name is Ethan Nash with Nash Consulting, and here across from me is
Michael Nash with Nash Consulting. Hey, everybody.
Today, we are talking about this big topic called autonomy. It's a topic that a lot of teams and workplaces talk about. And what we find is they talk about it and often have a difficult time putting autonomy into practice. So we're going to cover that today. Mike, why don't you start off by just telling us a little bit about autonomy? Like, why is autonomy important for us? Like, why do humans crave autonomy if they do?
Yeah, we do. We have the top 15 management skills that we've talked about, of course, on this podcast many, many times. And one of those items is provide autonomy and trust, or give autonomy and trust. And it's probably one of the more researched components of organizational life and motivating employees to produce and to bring their best self. There's just so much research around this. We've also, of course, talked about the SCARF model, those 5 domains that we're always looking for, but we're also kind of watching out for threats to, right? And the SCARF model, of course, was status, certainty, autonomy, which we're talking about today, relatedness, and fairness. You just can't get away from this idea that human beings not only are more likely to thrive and bring their best when they have a sense of control and a sense of autonomy, but also tend to shut down, right? And withdraw and have a really hard time bringing their best self when they feel micromanaged or over controlled, or they don't have a sense of personal freedom. I mean, Ethan, I don't know if it's fair to ask you that, but can you identify times in your life where you have felt over controlled, and how you feel about that, how you felt during those times? And can I remind you that I am your father and you are my son, and you could really go into some childhood stuff here if you wanted to. And you know what? Feel free.
Oh, wow. Well, the floodgates just opened, and that's by your doing.
Yep.
No, I mean, yeah, I can think of situations on both sides of the spectrum here where things felt overly controlled or in situations in which I felt like I had a ton of control over my approach to the work I was doing. I had a job early part of my career, and it was pretty dang controlled.
Hmm.
Now, I was right out of college, and so I didn't necessarily think about that I didn't have a lack of autonomy at this point and what was doing to my motivation. But it was everything from you show up at this time every day, you do this type of work between 8 and 10:30 every day, and you take lunch at this time. I remember at one point I took an hour and a half lunch for a few days in a row, because I was using that time to also go to the gym, have lunch, go to the gym. But I was showing up work a little bit earlier, staying a little bit late, right? And I figured, well, I'm putting in the same amount of time that's expected. And I remember just having a conversation with the boss of just like, no, that you can't do that. Like, you show up at this time, you take an hour lunch, and that's it, right?
Mm.
And this is a salaried position, by the way, right? So,
Right.
it is situations like that I look back at and go, those were key moments in which I just lost interest in that job, right? And I kind of felt like I was coming in, going through the motions, right? So there's this sense of I don't care, right? The apathy can settle in when we just have no control over what we do. So
Yes.
that's one of my experiences. What about you? What does it feel like for you when you feel like you've been over controlled? As well as, what does it feel like when you feel like you have the freedom to make some choices and the free and feel like you're trusted to make good choices?
It's interesting because I've been reading the research on how much this matters, and of course we've been teaching on this, and I've been reading about SCARF, and I've been processing what you just asked me recently because I knew this podcast was coming up, and I really feel it. Like, I really can identify those times in my life where I have felt controlled, when I felt that I really didn't have a lot of choices, and maybe because I didn't have enough psychological safety to speak out, I just kind of did what I was, what I thought was needed or what I thought was expected, or because I literally was not given choices. And I really do start to feel sometimes, frankly, almost depressed a little bit. It turns down my mood. I start to feel a little oppressed as well. I just, that feeling of being boxed in just makes my perspective on life not so energetic, and I don't feel so great about going through my day. I notice it pretty clearly. And I notice the opposite too. I feel like when I'm trusted, that feels like I feel so respected. I want to kind of rise to the occasion. I get more creative. I get more, I feel more accountable, right? Which is like, okay, I can't just do whatever because I'm going to have to deal with the consequences because I'm in charge here, right? So I really feel it. And it's really helped me even the last few days to think about how important it is to solve for this, to really find ways to give autonomy to employees.
Like you said, there's a lot of, I mean, they've really looked into this factor we're calling autonomy. There's a lot of research and study out there, but it is, what psychologists call, right, an intrinsic motivation factor, right? So there's extrinsic and there's intrinsic factors, right? Extrinsic being things external to ourselves, things like maybe money, fame, right? On an evolutionary level, extrinsic factors translate into things like food, shelter, status, access to resources, access to mates, right? So we are actually wired to want these extrinsic factors, right? But what they actually find is that in this day and age, once our basic human needs are being met, intrinsic factors then take center stage for our motivation, right? Meaning there is just a need, an innate need for us to steer our own ship. Autonomy turns us into much more effective versions of ourselves because we want that control in our life. And so if you think of it that way, that the intrinsic factors are more motivating for people once their human needs are being met, we start to realize, okay, this is a big deal that we need to put a focus on. Now, I know that you've been looking at some research just around autonomy in general, and I was hoping you could share a little bit about that with the audience here.
Yeah, there's a lot of research on this over the decades for sure. And we've looked this up. We've kind of looked into this years ago when we first were developing our Managing with Mind and Heart program. Recently, we've dug back in. There's been, just recently in the last 3 years, of course, there's just been a real renewed focus on autonomy because of the pandemic and everybody going home and the huge uptick in autonomy that so many people experienced. And there's lots of opportunity to study this. And so there's a lot of research on it. And then, of course, it's turned into this dynamic now where people are coming back to work, or certain people didn't actually get to go home. And so there's been this really kind of laser focus on the need for autonomy. And it's one of the things right now that employees are really looking for as they, they're leaving jobs because of a perceived lack of autonomy. They're looking for jobs that will provide more. But all that to say, there's been some new research on it. And just one study that I thought was really interesting that was done in 2020. And basically they found in this study that both individually, meaning individual tasks, but also group work, projects with others, they found that the more autonomy or the more perception of autonomy that people had, the more productive they were and the happier they were, the more elevated their mood was. And as they were looking at the study, there was, I think, initially this idea that autonomy brought happiness and happiness brought more productivity, but they controlled for a few things and found out that it was the opposite. They found out that the autonomy, the perception of autonomy, led to greater productivity, both individually on individual tasks, but also in group work. And it was the productivity that led to the happiness, which I thought was really interesting. And people felt better about themselves. In that study, there was two other really interesting things that came up. One was the kind of this ideal, optimal place where you're energized, your stress hormones are going, your epinephrine and your cortisol, and you're at this kind of ideal place where you get the maximum amount of productivity. If your levels are too low, and that comes from also not having enough autonomy, you're not going to produce as much. But if your levels were too high, you also would not produce as much. And they found that one of the main factors that led to those levels being too high was a lack of social support, that you didn't have a sense that people around you, including maybe your boss or your coworkers, were supporting you. So too much autonomy, a lot of autonomy without social support can lead to a decrease in productivity. So there's a sort of sweet spot where it was, a lot of autonomy and social support led to greater productivity. And then the last piece of this, which they found interesting, was in this experiment, they were paying people to do different tasks. The money had no effect on productivity in this experiment. And so I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was another kind of interesting takeaway.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And that insight right there, that it's not just we give autonomy and everybody is great and happy and performing well, right? You're combining that with the support and structure around that autonomy that leads to that high performance.
Yeah.
And, to add to kind of the research around it a little bit, I mean, the research around peak performance and, flow state, autonomy comes up over and over again as one of the factors that leads to that, as we're saying here. And I think a really cool example of how organizations have used autonomy mixed with the support to lead to high performance are this concept called 20% time that a lot of tech companies have used. Google's one, for example, but now Facebook has used it, LinkedIn, Apple. And the idea is they've given employees 20% of your time, you get to work on a project with other people that you're, interested in for this company, right? And things like, I think Google Maps came out of that, which
is kind of a pretty big deal, right? But the idea with that, it wasn't just, hey, go work on whatever you want and then come back to work. It was like they provided management support of what people wanted to work on, and team support and social support. And so it's a pretty cool thing when we know how to harness autonomy and utilize it. So by the way, we've referenced a couple times now our managing with mind and heart leadership development process. And I want to share just a little bit about that with you here. Obviously, this is called the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast, which is an extension of really our 6-day leadership development program that we've brought to thousands of organizations at this point. And Mike, I want you to tell our audience a little bit more about the Managing with Mind and Heart program.
Yeah, there's a quote that we love. It's Stephen Covey, and he said, you can pay people for their backs and their hands, but they volunteer their hearts and their brains. And we've mentioned that here on this show. We really, truly believe that for people to be able to show up and bring their best self and really bring their creativity and their extra effort and their great attitude and all these things, it requires a really skilled manager or managers or a leadership team. It requires an organization that really believes that best practice management skills are paramount. And so we have spent now almost 30 years going into organizations and walking through a 6-day course with managers that gives them everything from the mindset of a manager, which we've talked about in the show, which has to do with things like understanding the concept of morale and where it comes from, and psychological safety, and how important it is that your employees know that and see that you have their best interests at heart. It includes the top 15 management skills. And in fact, we go through every one of those skills throughout the 6-day program. We spend an entire day on performance management and the art of being able to give helpful feedback and bring an employee from maybe a less desirable set of behaviors to something that's working much better. And that's just such a challenge. We talk about how to run great meetings. We talk about behavior styles and give people a sense of kind of how they show up and how they can customize their management for the various behavior styles in their group. I won't go through all the topics, but it's really, really rich. It's 6 days of really equipping managers in thinking like a manager, practicing the best practice management skills, learning how to ask for feedback. People over the years have really told us many times how much it's impacted their success and their sense of self. Just to say it's not a 6-day consecutive program, that would, I think everybody's head would blow up. It's a lot of information. So we stretch it out over 6 weeks or 12 weeks. There's a lot of practical action planning that happens. And then lastly, I'll say it's pretty sticky. I mean, assuming that the organization is willing to engage in some sustainability practices, these skills tend to stick and they tend to make a big difference.
Yeah. And that last piece right there about making it sticky, sustainability, it is one of our core pillars with leadership development, which I think is a relatively unique approach that we take. From the very beginning to the very end, we are working on sustainability, building action plans, helping the leaders figure out how to make sure this doesn't become a flavor of the year. We've all been through training and development programs before that we show up and then we never talk about it again. And that does damage to the organization, right? So sustainability. And really the philosophy here is that, hey, you know what? Creating a healthy and thriving leadership culture requires that all leaders adopt, a consistent set of skills and mindsets and behaviors. And that's the premise here. It's getting all leaders in the organization on the same page, marching in the same direction. Anyways, we wanted to share a little bit more about our program with you here. And by the way, these 6-day workshop for your leaders, it goes beyond just theory, but we're really focusing on practical, actionable skills. We're prioritizing a lot of interactions, discussions, commitment building, all to really ensure maximum impact. So there you have it. There's our shameless plug for Managing with Mind and Heart. I figured we should mention it since we've mentioned it a few times already in this episode. Where were we to bring us back on track?
Yeah, well, I think we've made the case, right, that autonomy is, that it matters, that it's absolutely going to allow our employees to more likely to volunteer their hearts and their minds. We can put it that way, if they experience a fair amount of autonomy. So how do we get there?
Agreed. That is the big question, right? We probably all get it by now. Hopefully, autonomy matters. It's a big deal. It's more than just making your employees feel good, although that's important too, because imagine this, people that feel good perform better. But it's also about, by giving autonomy, people actually end up doing better work and more creative work, and goals get met much more often. But how do we do this is the big question. And so, Mike, let me ask you, where's the starting point? If I'm a manager of a team and I'm thinking about, okay, yeah, I want autonomy matters. I want to build that in to my team. Where do I start? Because that's usually the hardest place, is to know where to start.
Yeah, I think it starts with a mindset, I think, from the manager, and that mindset, kind of as a side note, has to be supported by the organization too. I actually have, unfortunately, I've worked with managers who actually have the mindset that we'll be talking about here, but their organization doesn't really reward it or support it. So it can be really frustrating, and it can be kind of a non-starter. But the mindset is really what we call an outcome-based mindset. It's a way of looking at how you look at the work or how you look at the productivity. That's the opposite of what's sometimes called surveillance-based mindset. Surveillance-based mindset is, it's I know you're being productive because your butt's in your chair for 8 hours a day, and I can monitor that, right? They focus on the details. It focuses on the process. It basically kind of just treats people like a pair of hands, which is kind of an analogy of, here's things I give you to do and you just do them for me, kind of thing, as opposed to the outcome-based management, which is, we define, either I define or we together define what the outcome looks like. What does great look like? We talk about expectations. We make sure we're all on the same page as to what the final result needs to look like. And we offer support along the way as needed. We make sure we're available, but we really let the employee do the thing, right? We really give them as much control as possible. And then we, come back and look at the results and maybe course correct, maybe celebrate, maybe set some new goals, learn from our mistakes, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to put that in a nutshell, right? Surveillance-based mindset versus outcome-based mindset. Surveillance-based is focusing on managing the details of the process, versus outcome-based mindset is the focus on the outcomes, right? Hence the outcome-based mindset, right? And so, at some level, it's like we're defining the goals, not defining necessarily how you get to those goals. And obviously that sounds pretty black and white. It's not always that simple. There are certain processes and ways and behaviors in which you may need to define. But what I find interesting here is that when we don't clearly define our goals, either as an organization, as a team, or at the individual level, we're kind of forced to manage behavior, right? Because we don't know really what we're clearly aiming for here. And so again, part of this can be a structural issue, right? Around getting clear goals as an organization.
Yeah, let me jump in on that, because that's so well put. The more clear you are about expectations, the less likely you're going to have to micromanage or jump in and reestablish priorities. So you actually end up being able to give more autonomy. And here's what can be there's some tension around this, right? Sometimes managers feel like, well, really kind of focusing in on clear expectations feels kind of micromanagey, right? But it's not. That actually frees the employee up to do their thing. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Right, right. Well, it's expectations and goals,
Right.
right? It's both. The defined goals, as long as that's clear, we all know what we're aiming for here, right? And there's a lot more creativity and freedom to get there, and you can get there in ways that you might not have even thought of before, right?
Yeah. And you can also provide goals and if there are checkpoints along the way, or let's put it this way, if there's guardrails, right? There's certain things during that process that need to happen or should not happen. That has to be talked about, right? It's not just the goal; it's all the stuff that you as the leader, as the manager, that you consider to be required. But the better that I communicate that, and the more we're both on the same page, much more likely I get to step back and let you do it.
Yeah. And I mean, let's be honest. To say as a manager, look at I'm defining goals, I'm defining some expectations here, right? But I don't know what I don't know, right? And not everything can be perfectly 100% crystal clear defined.
Good point.
So as a manager, it can feel like a bit of a risk to give autonomy over a lot of these kind of, behaviors or, the route they take to achieving the goals and what have you. It can feel like a risk because the risk is people might fail along the way, right? If I don't fully define how they get there, because I've gotten here before, so I know how to get there. Well, I have to be okay with that, right? I have to be okay with some failure along the way, right? Being willing to let people make mistakes is a bit of a sacrifice because when you choose not to overdefine the behaviors, people are going to learn from trial and error, right?
Yep.
And but the good thing about that is in the long run, you're a more high functioning team because people are learning along the way. And so to add in another factor into this whole autonomy thing, you have to have some psychological safety there as well, right? Because if there's not a level of psychological safety, right? If people feel like they're going to get punished for making mistakes, then they're not going to want a whole lot of autonomy at some level, right? They're not going to want that because they don't want to make a mistake. So there's multiple factors here that leads to those, the healthy teams we're looking for. But it's autonomy, it's psychological safety, and it's clear expectations and goals, all mixed together in this soup that really leads to some pretty significant outcomes. Does that make sense? How, where I'm coming from with that, of adding in the psychological safety factor?
I'm really glad you did. That's, that study from 2020, they said it was that social support that actually made the difference, not just the autonomy. And that's exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Right.
So we take that, that concept and we sit down with our employee and we might create a plan, right? We call these personal productivity plans, but it's the idea of, and these can be project-based, these can be time-based, right? Like for this week, they could be for a month, they can be longer than that. Or like I said, they can be for specific outcomes or specific projects, but they really are just basically what you've said. It's sitting down together and mapping out what is the goal, what does great look like, what are the guardrails, what are the expectations. To make sure that's really, really, really clear and that you're both on the same page. Make sure there's time frames given, you have the by-whens, all that kind of stuff. And then you might establish a check-in schedule. Just as a side note, Ethan, I think that we tend as humans to think in kind of binary terms. I either have autonomy or I don't, right? You're either holding me, if you're holding me accountable, therefore you're micromanaging me, right? The idea is, of course, there's a kind of a mix of I'm going to be involved as your manager, but I'm going to give you as much autonomy as possible. So the fact that we might have check-ins, I'm not taking your autonomy away from you. What I'm doing is I'm offering support along the way. Maybe I'm offering you that opportunity to do what you just described, where maybe there's some course correction that we need to engage in at our first or second checkpoint. And that's a great time to stop and do that, as opposed to waiting till we're at the end and we're already 50 degrees off course. So again, you in this productivity plan, you set the goals and the expectations. You maybe set some checkpoints along the way. And then basically you let the employee do their thing. And at the end, there's some kind of check-in, right? Some kind of debrief, some kind of celebration for what was accomplished. And then, as you said, learning from the misses.
Good, good. So we are talking about this personal productivity plan.
Right.
So after we go from, hey, let's look at our mindset a little bit about how we manage people, right? Our mindset around autonomy and working to adopt the outcome-based mindset. Then you're saying the kind of the next step here is a one-on-one conversation with each one of your employees in which you're doing this right here, creating their plan for them about what is expected, the parameters, where they have freedom within those parameters, and then having some check-ins and debriefing so you have that feedback loop to continue to refine the process and adjust along the way. Right? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's perfect. And again, it can be a regular occurrence. So it can be sort of time-based, or it can really be a thing that happens when there's a specific project or task or, initiative on the table. That's kind of the mindset, right? We're talking about that outcome-based mindset as opposed to surveillance. That kind of leads into that idea of setting these personal productivity plans with people. That's not the whole story. What else do we want to be thinking about in order to maximize autonomy and be that kind of workplace that attracts people? Because people are looking for this right now. They're looking for autonomy.
All right, great. So we're working on a personal productivity plan. How does this, what does this look like? How would this show up if you're having a conversation with one of your employees of creating this plan?
Well, yeah, let's do it together here. Again, just to remind us all that there's a couple different applications here. They can be time-based or project-based. So I'm your manager in this scenario, Ethan, and let's do one of these.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for meeting with me. It's our one-on-one. We're meeting here at the beginning of the month. Hey, as we do every month, let's kind of look at your personal productivity plan for this month. In this case, side note, we're doing kind of a monthly version of the PPP, the personal productivity plan. Sometimes they could be weekly, they could be every other week. But hey, let's look at your month, Ethan, and let's talk about kind of what you want to accomplish. What's going to make you feel really good about your month when we get to the 31st. What will you have accomplished? What will you have spent your time on? I've got a couple things to add, but what do you think? What do you want to have done by the end of this month?
Well, by the end of this month, when I look out at, the goals that we set as a team and organization at the beginning of this year, I think the next steps for me is, I think I can have the new client management system fully implemented in the sense that our team can start using it, at least the basics of it, and have completed some training videos for everybody as a resource as they learn this program. So that's one of my goals for this month. And to me, that seems to align with the overall yearly goal we had of improving our technologies as a team. Is that all right with you? Does that seem fair?
That sounds great. And you'd really, given the month you have ahead of you with the meetings and the retreat, that feels like you probably could get that done. That's not going to be too much of a stretch.
You're really underestimating me, aren't you?
I just want to make sure. I want you to have a work-life balance, dude. So
yeah,
remember that in this relationship we have too, not completely making the goal doesn't mean that we all fall apart and, there's punishment and all that kind of stuff, right? We can always adjust. And in fact, you and I might want to maybe just meet once during the month to just kind of assess how things are going.
Yeah, that sounds good. And now that you mention it, I guess it is a bit of a big bite to chew this month. We have those 2-hour-and-a-half meetings to go over accounting and finance this month. Would it be possible if I could just get a follow-up report from that, since, my contributions are usually fairly minimal in those meetings. And that would give me more time to focus on these goals if they seem like they're bigger priorities than me being a part of those meetings.
No, that's actually a great idea. Yeah, I actually prefer you not being at those meetings. Just kidding. Just kidding. No. Yeah, I will do that. That's a really good idea. That'll give you several more hours. No, I like it. I think that's a good goal. Let me ask you also, you've got some one-on-ones you're going to have to conduct during the month. How many one-on-ones are you planning on implementing in this next month, would you say?
Well, I like to do a one-on-one with everybody a month, and I have 4 staff members, so 4.
Okay. Awesome. Let's put that down there as one of your goals as well. Okay. Side note, we might talk about a few more things. We established that together. And then Ethan, let's, I don't want to dictate this, but what support do you need? Including, do you want to get together once or more throughout this month and check in and see how things are going? And are there any other things I can do for you? Help you be successful?
Well, I think the mid-month check-in that we already discussed is basically what I need right now, but I don't know what's going to come up. So hopefully I can just reach out to you if we need to put our heads together to regroup or brainstorm on some solutions to make this happen.
Yeah. Let me just reiterate that. Yeah, please check in anytime. I'm not always available, but I will always get back to you.
Great. That sounds good.
Yeah. That's the idea. That's great. And then of course we would get together at the end of the month, and we would, it would be important that both of us come prepared to talk about those exact things that we just talked about. It'd be a bummer if we got together and I didn't bring that stuff up, what you allow, you teach. You would feel less supported. You would feel less motivated next month if I just dropped the ball, right? So the follow-up is really important on this. It's important to celebrate, and I don't mean, throw a party, but, you accomplished your goals, or a lot of them or most of them. And that's worth saying something about that. That's worth congratulating you and, being impressed, and et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah,
that's how that works.
Definitely. Yeah. And what I like when, about the personal productivity plans, or at least a way to approach it, is, and you probably noticed this when we had this kind of mock conversation here, but I referenced, our organizational or team goals that we set for the year. And so if I'm working on this PPP with an employee, I'd like to review those goals at each one of these meetings to remember, like, hey, as we kind of work together here, and I give you some autonomy to set your goals for this month, for example, let's just make sure they're in alignment with what we're trying to achieve overall. And then I also, would encourage, like, hey, maybe there's some other things you want to achieve here that might not necessarily be directly connected with our quarterly or yearly goal. But what are some other things you might be wanting to focus on this quarter, or month, whether it is different professional development opportunities that you have in mind, conversations you want to have with different people in terms of, being mentored or things like that. I like to, obviously we need to focus on the overall goals, but then this is where you can give some autonomy to say what else might be important to you in your work world right now. So you can do both. And I like that approach.
Yeah, I like that a lot. We don't need to do any more examples, but just, again, another example of this would be project-based as opposed to time-based. But yeah, that's the idea. I like it. And it reminds me, I wanted to just give one kind of a side, not really a caution, but just something to keep in mind, is that, this mindset that we're talking about, of course, is the manager's mindset. It's this, it's the opposite of the surveillance-based. It's the outcome-based. One thing to keep in mind is that, managers are humans too, by the way, and they have the same needs as everyone else, including a need for autonomy. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because sometimes there's this tension, or even this clash between the manager's need, or their perceived need for autonomy, and how that interplays with the employee's need for autonomy. And so you'll have these situations where someone becomes a manager and they are really enjoying the control that comes with being a manager. And so in a sense, they're actually getting their autonomy needs met at the expense of the autonomy need of the employee. So this takes, I think, some extra awareness on the part of managers to think about their needs and making sure that their need for autonomy isn't somehow clashing with the autonomy need of the employee.
It is a strange thing because we want autonomy as managers as well. And if we're not careful, we're going to take autonomy away from everybody else to meet our needs.
Yes.
And that's why being in a management leadership position is a sacrifice, right? Unless you're willing to make some sacrifices with your own needs, maybe you're not best suited for a management position or a leadership position at this point until you can be willing to make some of those sacrifices.
Yeah, and I would say also just look at as a manager, where else can I get my autonomy needs met, right? So, you don't have to not get those needs met, just don't get them met at the expense of somebody else.
Very true. Very true. Well, good. So again, I mean, we've talked about this mindset that managers, really need to adopt, right? It's almost like step one is changing the mindset, right? You're creating these personal productivity plans with each employee, but that's a really, really great, first couple steps there. But there are all sorts of other opportunities to give autonomy to your employees, right? These are what we might call autonomy bumps. And there's actually this quote that I really like from the Neuro Leadership Institute. I'm just going to read it because it's great, I think. They say, the variable that makes a big difference in feeling motivated is not that you've got a ton of autonomy or get to do whatever you want. It's that you got a little more autonomy and control than you had expected. Yep. Even a little autonomy bump, even if it seems insignificant, ends up being really powerful. And I like that. I like what they're saying there because, yeah, there are going to be some jobs in which there's all sorts of opportunities that you can see to give a ton of autonomy, and it's going to work, right? The person's going to do well. They're going to perform well. And there's other jobs that you look at and it's like, gosh, I'm really struggling to find where I can give, huge amounts of autonomy given just the nature of the job, right? We're working in a factory, on a line, or whatever it may be. But the point here is that you don't necessarily have to just say, do whatever you want, whenever you want, wherever you want, for people to experience a felt sense of autonomy. All that has to happen is they get more than they expected to have.
Right.
And so we got to talk about this, right? What are ways in which we can provide employees autonomy bumps? What have you seen that's worked for you or for the clients that you've worked with?
Well, let's kind of look at the categories, right? You've got the kind of the basic, the where I work, when I work, how I work, with whom I work, what I work on, right? There's these categories. And there's some research that indicates that, well, first of all, that all of those are great opportunities to look for autonomy bumps that will actually increase well-being and productivity. There's been a lot of focus lately, of course, since the pandemic on where I work. And that's been a big deal. The where, of course, because sometimes the where is at home, tends to also bring with it the when and how, right? You get a lot more autonomy when you're at home. So that's been a big deal. And a lot of people are experiencing that and getting one or more days home a week. And in general, they've found that it has increased productivity. It also has made managing much harder, which is one of the reasons we're talking about this today. But again, the research tends to indicate that there is a productivity bump when people get to think about, choose where. It's possible. There's at least some indication in the research that there's even more motivation when you get a chance to decide when you get some control over your schedule. How, meaning maybe the order of things I work on or the process. And then there's even more benefits, more autonomy bump, more productivity when you get to choose the projects to work on and who you get to work with, right? So I would just suggest that managers maybe think about those categories: where, when, how, with whom, what, and process that based on your actual workplace, right? So where, for example, is there other options besides either work or home? What about at work? Are there options for a different location, work? Do you have to be in the office all the time? Can you go someplace else? Are there different places in the office?
Thanks for adding that last point there, because there are some workplaces where we really do for whatever reason, we're asking people to come to work, but yeah, do you have to sit in an assigned place the whole time, right? Is there or can you kind of move around, work in different workspaces in that place, right? So there's a range of where to work. Like I can either work in Columbia and do my work. That's at one end of the spectrum versus, hey, we have unassigned desks and I get to choose kind of where I want to work that day.
Yeah. Yep. I worked with one team that just recently, because of post-pandemic issues and dynamics, they actually got together. This was an HR department, and they actually kind of put everything back up on the wall and said, let's look at our jobs and what we do. And they did this cool survey, and they said, what are you not doing that you'd like to be doing? What are some things you'd like to try? And it was really cool. It's almost like they said, let's shake things up and let's see what people want to do, and let's see where we can make some adjustments, and let's move some jobs around. And they really kind of leaned into the, on what and with whom, and gave people a chance to speak to that. And they made some new choices. So it was really cool to see a group like that sort of engage in sort of group autonomy building like that.
Yeah. Things to think about here with all your employees: where, when, how, with whom, and what. And really, I would think that could be a collaborative conversation with employees as well. Like, hey, what am I not seeing here? Like, where could you benefit from with whom and on what you work on? What would you like to be working on that you're not? Things like that. I mean, all of these can be conversations, and it's going to be unique to each organization.
Exactly.
So,
yep. And schedules is a really general, it's generally possible to sit down and look at schedules, and, is there some flexibility there? Can you give the employee some choices? It's not always possible. You and I both know that, but when it is possible, explore. And what you just said, Ethan, say more about that. Having conversations about this, right? This isn't something that the manager just needs to take, fix on their own in the office by themselves and then come out with a plan, right? How would you lean into that, making this a discussion with your employees?
Well, I mean, it's I don't know what to say besides addressing these with each one of your employees or as a group, right? And yeah, there might be, like, as far as where I work, right? Maybe the organization at the top level has decided we are all working in the office. Okay. And so that's something that you got to be upfront about. Yeah. Okay. Hey, that doesn't look like that's something that's going to change. We're all here to work in this office together. But are there ways in which, you all would feel better about, being here in the office? Right? Are there different amenities or things or desk spaces or workspaces that would be helpful for you or beneficial for you, right? And that can be that group conversation, right? The when and how. Well, let's think about the how. Maybe you're asking, look, this is what we're trying to accomplish. This is what we're doing. I see we've generally had this process to accomplish that work. Would you approach this in a different way if it was up to you? How would you approach that? Yeah. Right. And if it seems like, hey, that's an approach that's not going to burn down the building or, ruin us as an organization, and it seems like that's a good way to reach the goal, even if in the back of your mind you're thinking, well, that's not how I would do it, that seems a little bit less efficient. Well, is there any problem with letting that person go out and do it that way? Right. So pick their brains on that. Yeah. Is this process the way you would do it? And then again, I think on what to work on, it's a conversation saying, hey, here are your job responsibilities, right? These are the things on your job description. Here's a thing, that you're expected to do. What else would you want to be working on, right? Magic wand here in this workplace. If you could spend some of your time working on something else, what would that be? Right. And if it seems reasonable and it's still aligned with the organization and what they're trying to do, well, maybe you give them that freedom. So I don't know, it's just a conversation. I don't have any more specific details about how to have that besides ask and stay open-minded about it, right? Stay open-minded that it may seem risky for you to letting people go out and work on other things or accomplish tasks in a different way, right? The results in the long run with those autonomy bumps I think is going to be well worth it.
Yeah. I just want to emphasize what you just said there, Ethan, that we almost say it almost like an obvious, like, well, yeah, have a conversation with your employees. Like we know that, right? But it's interesting. This conversation around autonomy, I don't know that managers often think about this, of actually sitting down and asking these questions. What is your current sense of your own autonomy? Do you feel like you need more? Do you feel like you have too much? What's your perception of the autonomy that you have right now? And like you said, what would you like to be doing? What autonomy bumps could we explore together? Give me some feedback as a manager on how I'm managing. Am I over managing? Am I micromanaging? Am I giving you and others too much space and not checking in enough? I just really want to emphasize this, leaning into those, this is a great topic for those one-on-one conversations. Just ask. And like you said, listen, be open, and don't make decisions. I'm talking to myself here, right? Because I'm a promoter conductor. In those conversations, you don't have to arrive at decisions right then in those conversations, right? Have conversations, listen, take notes, go back, consider it, circle back, right? Be thoughtful about it. But you can make some adjustments based on having a series of really good conversations with your employees.
Yeah. Yeah. And, let me maybe add some ideas here to, when you're having this conversation with your employees.
Yeah.
I get that where people are working could be totally out of your control, mostly as a manager. Even with whom and on what could be somewhat hard to find adjustments for, depending on your workplace. But I think it's the when, or mostly the how, that provides the most area for opportunity when you're stuck on figuring out, how do I give more autonomy? I think it's the how. For example, when they look at some of the biggest demotivators in the workplace, there's actually many studies that point to kind of the huge variety of, arbitrary, disliked, or, somewhat unnecessary rules and policies as one of the biggest demotivators. Right. And so I think that's an opportunity right there, is to have a conversation like, hey, what are some of our rules or processes that don't necessarily substantially help us reach our business goals? Right. For example, hey, can we listen to music while we work? Right. And, there are some workplaces that they've said, no, we don't want you to have your earphones in while you work. Yeah, I get if it's a safety issue, maybe that's not a great thing, but yeah, maybe we can do that. Or, hey, can I decorate my workspace the way I want to decorate it? Right. Or how about things like dress codes and things like that? Do we have any evidence besides, outside of personal preference, that a dress code helps us substantially achieve our business outcomes and goals? Right. So looking at the how in these different areas and getting creative is a great way, I think, to provide different autonomy bumps.
You know what, Ethan? You can start wearing jeans on Friday.
Yes.
How's that feel?
Right.
Yeah, no, that's sarcastic, because that's such a silly and small, almost insulting thing. But what you're getting at is, I'm just going to almost repeat what you said, is look for those policy options, even that you can just make changes and loosen up and let go. And you're right. The studies show that even those little autonomy bumps make a big deal, like decorating or, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's another one that I've enjoyed receiving as an autonomy bump in the past. What about training and development opportunities? Yeah, you're going to have certain training and development that you're going to need to go to based on your job. What if you ask your employees, what else are you interested in? Like, get outside the box here. Even think outside your current job responsibilities. Where would you like to develop yourself or develop some of your skills? And then, hey, if you have a budget for that, can you provide that employee, the budget to go out and get that training or development on their own? That can work in a lot of jobs, I think.
Yeah, that's great.
Giving them the autonomy there. What else? What are some other just kind of quick hit ways, ideas for autonomy bumps?
How would you like to be evaluated? Let's let employees sound in on that. And we don't have time to get into the specifics on that one, but that's a really cool one to give people some time to, to be creative about that. It really is cool, because it speaks to what people care about and what they're motivated by and what their values are. How should we do our meetings? When should we have our meetings? How should they be run? What should we talk about? Let's together. That would be a group autonomy discussion, right? There's really so many options. And I think, again, you'll get more ideas from this by asking your employees about this.
Yeah. It could be also, start and stop times, for example.
Mhm.
Like, hey, maybe you are a place that you come in and you got to punch the clock, but, is there a range in which you can start? And is there a range in which you can wrap up for the day, for example? If that's a workplace, if that's the way your workplace is set up. Break times, like, is there really any benefit to controlling when exactly people get to take their breaks? Maybe there is. Again, depending if you're in a a manufacturing factory and you got to keep the lines running, sure, but that might be an area for opportunity.
You could give employees projects that normally the manager would take care of, right? You could say, for example, hey, I'm going to give you some guidelines and some guardrails, but you three, how about, would you be interested in planning the annual retreat? There's lots of those kinds of things too that managers can either partially or completely let go of and hand away. That's very much in accordance with the whole decision-making model that we've talked about here. It's those different types of decisions that a manager might make. A style one, the manager just makes the decision, but one of the ways to provide autonomy is to use other styles for it. So, this whole concept of autonomy kind of dovetails into that decision-making model as well.
Great. So yeah, by the way, I'm going to link to a few episodes in the show notes that we've referenced here. I'll link to our decision-making episodes about the decision-making styles. I'm going to link to the episode on SCARF that we talked about at the beginning of this episode. But hey, we're on the topic of decision-making, right? And obviously allowing employees to either sound in on decisions, right? Have a voice in decisions, or being able to own the decision for themselves.
Right.
And so this is one of, I think, the best ways to provide employees autonomy is to look at their job and figure out where do they have decision-making freedom in their job. We've probably all been in a role or witnessed a role in which an employee has to check in with somebody for any sort of decision. And that can be pretty draining, right? So what would this look like? I say I'm sitting down with my employee and I'm looking at their job and I want to provide them some more autonomy here. How could I look at their job with them and figure out where can I give them more decision-making ownership and autonomy?
Great question. And that conversation you just referenced there that you would have, I just think you should have. It's interesting how often I've run into situations where actually, I'm gonna just tell you this quick story. I happen to be coaching a manager and an employee, separately, and the employee said to me in one of our conversations, "My manager is such a micromanager. I have to go to her for everything. I don't get to make any decisions on my own." Later on, I was coaching the manager, and she says to me about that employee, I have this employee that just will not take any initiative, and he comes to me for everything and won't do anything on his own and asks me before he does anything. And it was so interesting to find out that these two people wanted the exact same thing, but they hadn't talked about it. And so this conversation you're referencing here is so important. And the idea is, you basically look at the job of look at this person's job, and you kind of come up with some categories, right? It's basically 3 categories, but we call it 4, and you'll see why. Category number 1, just do it. Like, this is the stuff in your job that you should just do, take care of it. You don't have to check with me. If a problem comes up in this area, solve it. You don't have to tell me later. It's just yours. Take care of it. And there's other parts of your job that are do, then tell. Do it and then let me know. When these things happen, when these problems occur, when you solve these things, when you make these decisions, great. That's yours, but always FYI me about these for various reasons. Keep me informed, or so, I can have your back later, whatever. Third category, consult then do. This is stuff that if you choose to go in this direction, or you want to make a decision or do something here, let's talk first. And that's the 3 categories. The last one is don't do it. That's not yours. And it's good to include that, because sometimes there's misalignment on those things. What is mine and what's not mine? What's yours, what's not yours. But you get clear on that. You have a conversation, and there's so much more freedom now. Just having both of you on the same page. allows you to go forward with less conflict, with less anxiety. And then, of course, the goal is to move things up that list over time. Something that used to be consult then do, well, maybe we can move that to do then tell, right? So the idea is to give increasingly more autonomy as there's more trust, as there's more experience. But it's just kind of a nice model to really give you something to kind of to talk about together with your employee and set some goals around that.
It can be tricky. And again, it's coming back to something I mentioned earlier. Like, we don't know what we don't know. And you have to be able to be comfortable with a bit of a trial and error process, right? Like, I don't exactly know always what type of decisions I need for you to come to me with versus ones that you should at least, talk to this person or that person versus the ones you just handle on your own.
Right.
Yeah. And you got to be okay with that ambiguity, right? And if anything, I would advise leaning more towards giving more decision-making freedom to people, and then, regrouping and adjusting from there if need be. But I don't know, it can be tricky, and but don't be afraid of these conversations just because you don't exactly know how it's going to turn out or where to give that freedom.
That's really
Start
good.
somewhere.
Yeah, that's really good. And a principle there, you just reminded me of this, is make sure you keep the psychological safety present there, meaning that if you work for me and you do it, you make a decision that I wish you hadn't, I wish you would have come to me first, but we never really had that conversation. That's not time for me to berate you or punish you or shame you for doing that, right? That's a time for us to get together and have a conversation and course adjust, right? So I think it's really important that we don't punish people for stepping out and for being creative, in an area, especially when there hasn't really been discussion.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, unless there's more you want to say on this topic, I think that this is a good place to end it. We've hopefully given you some concepts around why autonomy is so important, help you think a little bit more about the mindset you have as you think about autonomy, right? The outcomes-based mindset versus the surveillance-based mindset. How to sit down with your employees and talk about their personal productivity plans, how to give autonomy bumps, and how to have those conversations with them about the where, when, and how, with whom, and on what in their jobs. And then other ideas in terms of where you can give autonomy bumps, whether it comes to decision-making freedom, letting them weigh in on some of the decisions you have to make, looking at rules, policies, or procedures, whatever. The point is that you have to take this stuff and apply it to your personal situation, right? And your workplace and your team. There's no one size fit all. But hopefully this provides you some frameworks and some ideas to get those conversations going. So, Mike, how do you want to end this here? Anything else you want to say?
No, I always say no, then I say something. Just that this is, I like the way you described the trial and error, and this is a tough area. Even when we teach this, it actually is one of the harder topics to talk through, because it has to be so customized, and there's so many nuances, and there's so many differences in the jobs, and people have their own needs and desires. So I just say be open, have a growth mindset, ask for feedback, learn, grow.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Folks, I want to mention one other thing here before we sign off for the day. If you haven't heard about our roughly monthly newsletter called the Managing with Mind and Heart newsletter, get on that. Sign up for that. Anyways, it's a mostly monthly newsletter in which we're putting out articles on topics that have to do with managing with mind and heart, right? We talk about autonomy. We just started working on a series about, handling conflict in the workplace, decision-making, how to have one-on-one meetings, just practical tips and tools for managers. So sign up for that newsletter. You can do so by either going to our website, nashconsulting.com, or you can text the word leading to 66866. I think that's all we got for you today, folks. Thank you, dear listeners. We appreciate you being a part of our Managing with Mind and Heart community. Farewell.